Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of administrative law. This week, we'll be looking at access to information, which is a really crucial step in the administrative law process. So, we talked last week about how administrative law involves looking at decisions that the executive government has made and then potentially reviewing or challenging those decisions if we need to. Access to information is the first step in that process. It's how we ground ourselves, how we find out what's gone on, and therefore arm ourselves with the tools that we need to move a matter forward. So in terms of the flowchart that we talked about last week, we're in week 2, obviously, but we're really at the first step and at a bit of a crossroads for deciding whether we will eventually go into merits review or judicial review. But this week, I'll present 2 videos. The first on freedom of information, which is about access to government documents more broadly and can involve a wide range of things that the government produces. And then in a separate video, we'll talk about reasons for decisions, which are much more targeted and focused on a particular decision made by the executive government that affects a particular individual or organisation. So freedom of information is quite broad. Reasons for decisions are much more specific, but both are really important to understanding how government decisions are made and how policies are developed and things like that. And we can actually use the 2 in combination. And at the end of the second video, we'll talk through some of those strategies as well. But let's start off with talking about freedom of information. And the thing to really keep in mind here is an underlying principle of open and transparent government. Freedom of information is all about laying bare government processes and making sure that we're able to find out as much information as we can about how the government is operating. And there are a number of strengths that come with that. So at an individual level, we have a right to find out what information the government has about ourselves. And if there's an error, we can correct that and make sure that the government information about us is up to date. It's thought to enhance the quality of decision making, although that is debatable. So we'll come back to that point in a moment. Freedom of information also results in a better informed electorate and therefore increases the chances of an informed participation in the democratic process. And in particular, sometimes you'll hear investigative journalists talking about reports or documents that they have been able to obtain via a freedom of information request or process, and then they're able to report on whatever decision was made, whatever policy was developed, using the access to that information. And that is a really important way of keeping governments accountable and making sure that they're doing the right thing. Lastly, there's an emerging thought that the information that the government collects using public funds should be a publicly available resource. And so, when we're using taxpayers' money, for example, to commission a report, to undergo some kind of scientific investigation, then that information should be available to the public as a whole to do further research on, to scrutinise all kinds of things. So information broadly is increasingly thought of as a resource. And so information collected by the government is thought to be an important resource that should be open to everyone to access, with some limits that we'll talk about. But let's return to a key debate within freedom of information, which is this idea that being able to access this information improves or enhances the quality of decisions that the government makes. On the one hand, and we talked about this a little bit last week, on the one hand, there's a school of thought that says that when we lay government processes bare, when we're able to access all the information and evidence that they had on hand to develop a policy or make a decision, that improves the opportunity to scrutinise that decision. The government knows that, so it's motivated to work harder to make a good decision in the first place. If there's a problem, it's easier to pick that up and then we can go back and correct it. And so it's thought that open and transparent governments make better decisions because they're motivated to get things right. Because if they don't, someone will pick it up. The flip side to that is an argument that if we have too much openness or too much transparency, there's a tension between politicians and ministers and the apolitical or hopefully impartial public service, who play a really important role in the executive government by providing advice to elected officials. And the mantra for the public service is that its advice to ministers should be able to be frank and fearless. They should be able to tell hard truths to ministers or elected officials. But there's the concern from people in the public service that if that frank and fearless advice gets out into the public, it might be misinterpreted, it might be taken out of context. And so it acts as a little bit of a halter on the kinds of things that public servants might say. We can have a debate in the tutorials about which side of the argument we come down on, or is there a compromise or a balance between the two positions that we can work towards? It's a really interesting discussion to be had, I think. But for now, it's worth keeping in mind that the underlying principle of the Act is a push towards or a lean in favour of openness and transparency rather than hiding processes and hiding decision making. So some of the key characteristics of the Freedom of Information Act broadly is that Section 11 creates a right of citizens to access any document of an agency, so say a government department or a minister. And what's important under Section 11, subsection 2, is that that right extends regardless of the reason for wanting the document. And so it's not a valid reason for an agency or a minister who has had a freedom of information request put to them to say, oh, I think this person's going to, use this information to, hurt my political reputation or to expose a mistake that I've made. So I'm not going to give it to them. That's the reason for wanting the document is usually not a barrier to access to that document. In terms of form, the request must be in writing, although that can be electronic online. So for example, in an email, or it can be in a hard copy in a letter. What's also really important is that the agency itself has to help with the application. So the application itself, if it isn't quite worded in the correct manner or if it isn't quite expressed in the right terms, the agency can't just say, well, you didn't meet the requirements, see you later. They actually have to actively help the applicant make a proper application. And they also have to help the applicant identify relevant documents. So a good example might be in a freedom of information request, a person might ask for a few reports relating to a particular matter. And the agency knows, because they commissioned those reports, that there's these series of reports that the applicant has asked for, but also really relevant to that is a survey that they conducted as well, perhaps. And so the onus is on the agency to actually be upfront with the applicant and say, look, you didn't ask for this survey, but it's pretty relevant to these reports that you were asking for. Did you want that as well? So this comes back to that underlying principle of openness and transparency. There really is a lot of mechanisms within the Freedom of Information Act to push agencies to be open and transparent. And this requirement that the agency help with the application is part of that. There are costs associated with a Freedom of Information request. Those costs are reduced if you're after your personal information, but there's usually a nominal application fee Plus, then you have to compensate the agency for its working time and also pay for photocopying costs and things like that. And that's quite reasonable. It's also in place to stop sort of needless or spurious freedom of information requests, just blanket asking for every document in the department or something like that. So there is a little check on that balance. The agency or the minister has 14 days to acknowledge that they've received a freedom of information request, and then they have to make a decision within 30 days whether to comply with that request, whether to grant access to those documents and then provide them, or whether they'll say, no, sorry, you can't access those particular documents, or a bit of balance to say, yes, you can have these ones, no, you can't have those ones. And in the next couple of slides, we'll talk about some of the reasons why an agency might be able to deny access to some documents. There is a little bit of scope if the request is really large to push out that 30-day limit, but that needs to be clearly explained to the applicant. They can say, yes, we've received your request. Yes, we're going to give you these documents, but it's going to take us a long time to track that down, or it's going to take us a long time to photocopy those all. So we won't have it to you in 30 days. We might have it to you in 45 days. So that's a broad process of a freedom of information application. The applicant makes the request in writing. They specify which documents or which classes of documents they're after. That then goes to the agency. The agency has to help make that application legitimate. They also have to help identify documents. Within 14 days, they say, yes, we've received that request. Within 30 days, they say yes or no. So some of the reasons why an agency might be able to say no and deny access to a particular document, there's a category of completely exempt documents, which people can never access through a freedom of information request. And those sort of fall into three classes. Documents that are about the workings of government that need to be protected, documents about third-party interests that need to be protected, and also documents where we might want to protect other recognised interests, for example, legal professional privilege. We'll talk through some examples of each of those in a moment. A second category of documents are conditionally exempt documents. So here, the presumption is that you should have access to that document, but there's also an acknowledgement that there might be a strong reason not to grant access to that document. So usually we class that in terms of the public interest. Is it in the public interest that this document be released, or is the public interest better served by not granting access to that document? And so there's a condition on whether you could access or not. We'll talk through in a few slides' time factors in the Act that should favour access to a document. So actually legislated reasons why it would be in the public interest to release a particular document, and also some specified irrelevant factors. So things that the agency or minister can't use as excuses for denying access. So we'll talk through both of those. Turning firstly to the exempt documents, though. The first sort of class is protecting the workings of government. So if you've heard the expression, you don't want to see how a sausage is made, it's a little bit like that. We don't want to expose the sometimes very messy and ugly inner workings of government. And so the really classic example here is a cabinet document. And that's because cabinet is supposed to be a forum for the top elected officials who also sit in the executive under a Westminster system like Australia to have a really frank and robust and open debate about what the government's policy is going to be. And the thinking is that cabinet should be a safe space where everyone can put whatever their opinion is out on the table, and then that is done in complete confidence, and that confidence will be respected. They can have a really rigorous debate, and then once they leave the cabinet room, the government's policy is set, and it's hopefully the best decision that they could make, having benefited from a really rigorous and open debate. And the concern is that if that debate were to be exposed, it wouldn't be as open and frank and rigorous as it otherwise might be. And so cabinet documents are protected. You can't access those under freedom of information. But also documents that are prepared and submitted to cabinet, for example, a report that might speak to or be relevant to a government policy, if that goes into cabinet and the cabinet members are able to consider it in that debate, then that will be protected from a freedom of information request as well. The tricky thing is that we sort of, as a loophole's not the right word, but as a way of protecting documents that the government doesn't want released, the sort of the classic image or the stereotype is wagons of documents being wheeled up into the cabinet room and just being stamped cabinet all over them so that they can't be released, even if cabinet doesn't really end up considering those documents. So while the underlying reason for protecting or exempting cabinet documents from a freedom of information request is quite solid, there is scope and problems with its misuse. The other sort of classic example of an exempt document would be things related to national security, defence, international relations, things that, you know, for Australia's security and for our international interests, we can't have exposed to everyone. So obviously, you know, things like ASIO, you know, who they're looking at, what they're doing, agents, all that kind of stuff, that can't be made public. Debates and policy discussions about how Australia should deal with or relate to other countries, what our policies should be, how we should react to international developments, all of that is exempt as well to protect Australia's international reputation. Those are just two examples. You do really need to go through the Act to have a look at, there's a really long list. Just take a minute to go through and check what those all are. Some of them are quite technical, but you know, they do pop up from time to time. I'm just sticking with the main examples here. Other kinds of exempt documents are to protect third-party interests. So, for example, people's personal information, protecting confidential informants, and also things like trade secrets or commercial information. Obviously, you know, there's a strong benefit to keeping that a secret, and so those will also be exempt from a freedom of information request. And then the last category are a series of other recognised interests. So things like legal professional privilege. So the advice that a lawyer gives to their client can't be released. And so the advice that the government solicitor gives to the government, that usually can't be released unless the government chooses to. Other things like the electoral rolls, so your personal details on the electoral roll can't be made public via a freedom of information request, and related documents like that can't be as well. Again, there's quite a comprehensive list in the Act that you do need to have a look at as well. Then we move to the category of conditionally exempt documents. So documents where the agency is required to disclose it unless they can establish that it wouldn't be in the public interest to disclose it. So just a couple of examples: Commonwealth-state relations or internal deliberations. The presumption is that those should be disclosed unless the agency or the minister can show that it wouldn't be in the public interest to release that information. So, for example, internal deliberations, The sort of class of documents that I talked about earlier, the sort of that frank and fearless advice that public servants should be giving to ministers and elected officials. On the one hand, it is really useful to the public to find out, how a decision is made or why it was made in a particular way, what the minister was told before they made a particular decision or developed a policy. But on the other hand, the agency might be able to establish that there is a good reason not to disclose that frank and fearless advice. And so we'll talk through in a moment some of the reasons why or why not. Commonwealth-state relations is another good example because the Australian Federation as a whole relies on, a certain amount of goodwill between the Commonwealth, the federal government, and the state governments. It's a little bit like Australia's international relations and why it's important to protect some documents that speak to Australia's relationship with other countries. The relationship between Commonwealth and state governments can itself be, a fragile thing at times too. And so as a matter of public interest, it might be really important to find out why a particular decision was made in relation to, border closures is the big example at the moment with coronavirus. But at the same time, to protect the goodwill within the Federation, there might be a good reason not to disclose those documents at times as well. So what are some of those reasons? Section 11B lists some of the factors that would favour access. So factors that would weigh on the side of the agency having to disclose that information. And so those are quite broad, promoting the objects of the Act. So coming back to those ideas of open government and transparency. If the document would inform debate on a matter of public importance, it should generally be disclosed as well. So looking at the importance of the matter that the document relates to. Public expenditure, promoting oversight of that, as a means of preventing or reducing corruption. That's a really important factor as well, which would lend itself towards releasing that information. And also allowing a person to access their own personal information is generally a reason why you should be allowed to access that information. If it's information that relates specifically to you, the presumption is that you should be able to view that information. At the same time, factors that the government can't use to prevent access, and when you read through these that they're all coming from a particular place, they're all coming from reasons that the government has given in the past. And so the government can't deny access to a document just because it would cause embarrassment or loss of confidence in the Commonwealth government. So, we know we made a mistake, so we don't want you to see that mistake. Not a good enough reason. A concern that it could be misinterpreted, also not a relevant factor. The seniority of the author of the document is also not a reason. So just because the person is at a high level within the public service, that's not a good enough reason to say, well, you can't access that document. And lastly, a concern that it could result in confusion or unnecessary debate. Again, not a valid reason to deny access to a document. So that sort of takes us to the end of our discussion about freedom of information. As I've sort of pointed out, there is more detail within the Freedom of Information Act around types of documents that are exempt that you do need to have a look at. But this is just a broad overview to sort of position you within a freedom of information request. And really what it's going to come down to, especially with those conditionally exempt documents, is for the agency to balance the public interest and to make an argument about what is in the public interest. it also means that it's open to the applicant to make those arguments as well. So in a freedom of information application, an applicant who's requesting a document which is conditionally exempt, like a document relating to Commonwealth-state relations or the internal workings of government, it's important within that to present some arguments about, well, I know that this could go either way. These are the reasons why it's in the public interest to disclose this document. These are, this is why this would promote open government, or this is why me being able to view this document would inform debate of a matter of public importance, things like that. So being really upfront in the application about why you want it, even though the reasons why are not a reason to deny the access, being upfront about why you want a document and why it's in the public interest for you to be able to access that document is a real strength in putting forward a good freedom of information application. We'll call it there for that. For this video. We'll be back in part 2 to talk about the reasons for decisions, which are a much more specific class of access to information. So we'll see you then.